Brooklyn streets got the hustle and the muscle, but the vision sleeps. Innovation locked up waiting to be freed. We got the roots, but we gotta plant the seed. Factory silent, dreams on hold. Time to break the mold, let the story unfold. In the city that never sleeps, we're rising. Through the struggle and the grind, we're climbing. We got the fire, the drive, the vibe. New York's on the move, watch us come alive. Yeah, yeah, New York, say time to shine. From the shadows to the stars, the future's yours and mine.
I want to welcome you to Call or Raise Your Bets on Sovereign Space. Before we get started, I want to give right of place to our host, Milbank, and just a couple of remarks from Dara, representing Milbank Law. And to you, Dara.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and welcome everyone here in person and online. I'm Dara Panahy. I lead the space business practice here at Milbank. We're a global law firm, and we advise all actors in the space industry on corporate, commercial, finance, regulatory, insurance, and unfortunately, from time to time, restructuring matters as well. We've been doing this in terms of a practice for over 30 years now. We're delighted to be part of this community and very much also nurture and appreciate our relationship with SSPI, as well as the series here with respect to the New York Space Business Roundtable. So thank you for the opportunity to work with you and partner once again, and looking forward to hearing the perspectives on this very topical issue regarding the rise again of space sovereignty.
Thank you so much. And so we're having this conversation today. This is part of a series that we have been having with the New York Space Business Roundtable. The series has been looking at the transition from government-led space endeavors to commercial space endeavors, and what that looks like in different regions. Today, our focus will be on Europe. Before we go too much further, let's just kind of do a little housekeeping, starting with that. For those of us in the room, there's a little refreshment over to the side. There will be nibbles at the break, and then there will be a reception with food and everything on the second half. But this part of the meeting is actually being recorded. This is the first part of the meeting. The second half will not be recorded. It'll be a Chatham House rules, and we'll have a more intense conversation and hopefully get to say things that we might not otherwise say. So with that, let's welcome, let's give some introductions. Hey, this is me. That should have been up there already. Okay, so I want to thank our sponsors, Druva Space and TMT Law, are companies based in India, and they have been friends of the roundtable for the last 2 years. I'm very grateful for their support. And of course, again, our host, Milbank Space Smart, for hosting us today. We have our supporting organizations, Empire Space, here in New York City, New York, actually, the whole state, US-India Business Council, GSOA, the World Teleport Association, and then we have two brand new partners. I'm very happy to announce that SSPI has formed a partnership with Nova Space, formerly Euroconsult, and I think the other company was, I don't remember the name of the other company, but in any event, I'm really grateful. We've been having this conversation for a while, and they will be joining us at the next roundtable to give briefings, topical briefings at each roundtable going forward. And we also formed a partnership with SpaceCom Europe, which we are also pleased to announce. And with that, I'm going to take just one moment to allow a little bit of advertorial from one of our panelists, Melissa Patton, representing SpaceCom Europe.
Thank you so much for having me, Tamara. Delighted to be here. I am the head of US engagement for SpaceCom Europe. We have two shows, one in Scotland in December and another show in London in March. And really, SpaceCom Europe exists based upon three pillars, and it aligns really nicely with UK Space Agency. Pillar number one is innovation. Okay, bringing people together to spend money and finding different ways to do that. Pillar number two, the future of space. What does that look like? And our show brings defense, brings commercial, brings academia, brings workforce development, all under one opportunity to learn from each other for visibility, and obviously to figure out new ways to get streams of revenue. And lastly, everyone's talking about satellites, right? Manufacturing satellites, understanding what satellites can do, different ways of developing satellite technology. And that's one of our 3 pillars. We're super happy to be here. My team from Europe is watching from abroad, and we hope to have you at one of our shows.
So much. And so, as you all know, the typical thing that we do here at the New York Space Business Roundtable is lead with one of our Better Satellite World videos. We have a brand new one that I'm happy to present. And so with no further ado.
Space, not the safest place in the universe. Staying safe there and keeping the Earth safe while we do it is a big job. How do we do it? Let's start at the beginning. Everything that goes into space starts on top of a rocket, and rocket launches are violent. To reach orbit, one of these massive vehicles loaded with fuel accelerates from 0 to more than 17,000 miles per hour in a matter of minutes. That's why rocket launch and now rocket landings are regulated for safety. In the U.S., the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Commercial Space Transportation issues permission to launch after review of detailed plans. It also investigates failures that raise safety concerns. Other spacefaring nations have their own government agencies to regulate launches from their territory. CNES, the French National Space Agency, is the only one that also regulates a foreign launch site, the European Space Agency spaceport in French Guiana. Despite all the flames and noise, explosions on the launch pad are rare. Just in case, launch pads are carefully designed to protect the launch crew on the ground. But as the rocket lifts off, the territory and people it can threaten expands. That's why rocket launches are barred from steering over areas where people live during the early part of their flights. Their paths are also coordinated with air traffic control to avoid planes in flight. Vessels at sea are warned to keep watch for boosters falling from the sky. It's also why, as a final precaution, range safety officers can remotely destroy rockets in flight before they cause harm. Falling debris remains a potential risk, but no lives on the ground have ever been lost to space debris. But as our use of space increases, so may the risks. Satellites that orbit close to the Earth eventually re-enter the atmosphere and burn up, with many thousands of them already in orbit and more thousands on the way. Scientists are getting worried about pollution from space. In January 2025, more than 100 communication satellites fell into our atmosphere and burned up. They left behind traces of metals, including aluminum, copper, lithium, and niobium. The University of Leeds estimates that 1 in 10 particles floating in the upper atmosphere is a metal chip from a spacecraft. We don't yet know what, if any, impact they will have, but scientists are on the lookout for everything from damage to the ozone layer to strange chemical reactions. Since the first rocket reached Earth orbit in 1957, safety has been top of mind for the governments and companies launching them. That's why the odds of dying on Earth from something in space are less than 1 in 100 billion. Still, launching a rocket remains one of the hardest things we know how to do, and space will always be a dangerous place to visit. So you can bet on one thing: space safety, it's never going out of style. Space and satellite, the world's invisible, indispensable technologies. Brought to you by Space and Satellite Professionals International with the support of the American Space Exploration Fund. Additional support provided by Artel.
All right, and so let's meet our panelists, starting with our host, Dara Panahy. Dara Panahy is partner at Milbank LLP and a leading attorney in the global space, satellite, and aerospace sectors. He's advised on many of the industry's most significant transactions, covering financings, mergers, acquisitions, and regulatory matters. And his work has earned multiple Deal of the Year awards, recognized by Legal 500 USA and Chambers USA for excellence in telecommunications and satellite financing,
Dara also lectures at the International Space University and authors Milbank's Space Business Review newsletter. He speaks fluent Spanish and Farsi. Jacob Hafey is policy manager at Access Partnership's Washington, D.C. office. Jacob leads space and satellite policy at Access Partnership, helping U.S. and European operators navigate the complex policy landscape shaping cross-border data, cybersecurity, and emerging technologies. A specialist in U.S. East Asia relations, he previously directed the USAI Szymanski Rule of Law program on Capitol Hill and contributed to the World Justice Project's Global Rule of Law Index. Jacob holds an MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a BA in Chinese and International Relations from Tufts University. Dr. Melissa Patton, founder and managing partner of Patton Consulting Group and head of U.S. engagement for Spacecom Expo Europe, which, by the way, is a new partner for the roundtable. And we'll hear more about that. Dr. Melissa Patton is an executive strategist and entrepreneur whose work bridges workforce development, innovation, and the space economy. Through her firm and her leadership at Spacecom Expo Europe, she builds global partnerships connecting American companies with international markets. With more than 20 years in higher education and workforce strategy, she's known for designing education to industry pipelines that prepare people and organizations for the emerging space era. And finally, Mikel Savides, Senior Director, International Relations and Strategic Engagement at BlackSky. Mikel leads international relations and strategic engagement at BlackSky, where he advances partnerships that integrate space-based intelligence into global defense and crisis response. He's a former U.S. diplomat and Marine, and he brings deep experience in multilateral security cooperation and political/military strategy, with prior roles at the State Department and Lockheed Martin. Mikel holds a BA from UC San Diego. He's currently pursuing an executive MBA at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. And with that, let's jump into the roundtable.
So, to my esteemed panelists, welcome. I'm just going to start this conversation off in the simplest way possible. And I'm going to ask each of you to just take 1 minute to give us your definition of this word, this concept, European space sovereignty. And so, Dara, I'll start with you.
Thank you again, Tamara, and thank you, SSPI and New York Space Business Roundtable. So space, by definition, and historically has been a multinational, multidisciplinary effort. And the global ecosystem, whether you look at it as the manufacturers, the operators, the end users, have tended not to be isolated within a single country, or in some cases, a single region, just given the complexity of putting things, building things, designing them, putting them in space, operating them. You layer that on with the reality of sort of, let's call it the post-World War II security, financial, and economic paradigm, which meant that there was, on things that involved security, high technology, cutting edge innovation, there was a strong relationship between Europe and the US, stemming out of the Marshall Plan and things that came out of post-World War II. That economic and security paradigm is shifting. It's going through a reset. It has been for a while. And more recently, given how sort of US imperatives are focused on budgetary issues, political developments, Europe has come to the view that it needs to become more independent and more self-reliant when it comes to space-related efforts. That's finally layered on with the most important, I think, pressure point here, or call it catalyst, which is space is now a contested domain. It is a domain that's going to absolutely be used in the future for warfare, whether passively or actively, kinetically or otherwise. And so when you combine all of these elements, what does sovereignty mean at the end of the day? Europe has come to the view that it needs to maybe be interoperable, yet also be able to be self-sufficient going forward when it comes to space-related security.
So I'm going to kind of take this from a different perspective. It's right around January, and I was having a call with my buddy from London, and we had just gotten a new president, and we were having a conversation about what this could potentially look like. And this was before we knew what was going to happen. And I remember him having a conversation with me about the fact that it is now time for Europe to step up to the plate. It is now time for us to be independent, but yet at the same time, oxymoronically, we need to also have allies in the field, because there are real things getting ready to happen, and we all need to be on the same team. Breaking down silos and understanding that sovereignty is about, yeah, I need to understand how to do this on my own. There needs to be some independence, but at the same time, I need my brothers. And that's the way that I see it. And I think that conversation stemmed from my friend in workforce development in London, after he was digesting the fact that things are changing very, very quickly. Although extremely positively, things are changing and we need to get prepared.
Thank you, Tim, for having us here. And I think one of the things that we look at it from the industry perspective, and that we're hearing from a lot of our customers, is kind of a combination of both these things that we heard from both Dara and Melissa already. But I think one of the other things that we're hearing is there's also kind of this own push, not just from a sovereignty, from kind of technological control and both interdependence, but also independence. But there's the aspect of made in Europe, or made in Europe from the standpoint of growing native capabilities, as well as retaining talent, funding, financing, and knowledge within European borders. And I think combined with that, along with the aspect of this technological control that translates to things like assurances or guarantees that those critical national security capabilities aren't going to be turned off by some exogenous force, either a partner country or by a company, especially in a time of need, you kind of see this notion of sovereignty really becoming a combination or amalgamation of things. And it varies region to region, but within Europe specifically, I think one of the things, this is where we, from the commercial perspective, think that we can help, because space is both hard and it's expensive. And one of the things that we have the ability to do within the commercial space industry is to help them turn on capabilities right now, and at the same time, partner with them, collaborate with them in a way that really supports this idea of developing national capabilities, but puts them on a track of kind of that independent situation that they're hoping to get to.
Yeah, and just to build off of what some of my co-panelists have said, I really think that sovereignty boils down to two things. One is trust, and the other is defense. And I think also because American firms make up such a large share of the space market, the transatlantic relationship can't be ignored either. But sovereignty isn't something that's new to the European policy scene, and it's not new for just space. When we see an erosion of trust in American technologies, we also see a coupled backlash from European policymakers that want to distance themselves away from American tech. In 2013, this happened with the Snowden file leaks in the cloud context, and that's continued to this day. I think where defense plays into it is defense is so inexorably tied to the space sector, and it raises the stakes in all different ways. So I think if I were to like pin down a moment, the invasion of Ukraine was a watershed moment, I think both for sovereignty and the space sector in general. And I think ever since then, the conversation of sovereignty has included space and leads us to where we are today. So I don't see what's happening with the sovereignty and the space sovereignty debate being something that is about protectionism, for example. I see it mainly as a reflection of Europe not wanting to be at the behest of developments, decision-making that's happening outside of Europe and control its own destiny.
Mentioning the invasion of Ukraine at the specter of the actual defense of Europe. Would you agree that that is one of the largest drivers of the push for sovereignty, the recognition that Europe's defense decisions need to be managed by Europe? And I'd love to hear from the rest of the panelists on that as well.
Yeah, and I'll save time for my panelists to respond to that as well. But I think that the important thing to emphasize, though, is that it's not necessarily something that it has to be European companies and it has to be locally companies located in Europe. It's more the idea that American companies and companies from third countries in general need to provide services where they can guarantee to European companies that those services will be resilient, they won't be open to like influence from wherever that company may be based in. Space technologies are so critical and they provide such like fundamental services to people that if they're disrupted, it has way more of an effect than in a lot of other areas of digital technology. And I think that because of that, the consequences of something bad going on and affecting people makes the stakes so much higher for space.
Sure. So I agree with the point that Ukraine is a watershed moment, but I would almost reorient the conversation a little bit. And also one of the, I think, key drivers for the push to sovereignty is the fact that accessibility within space has become so much more accelerated, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, where the barriers to entry for especially smaller nations to access space capabilities was unfathomable 10 years ago. A lot of the conversations focus on these kind of somewhat anachronistic models of these massive billion-dollar legacy satellite programs, or they think about the agility of startups, but there are inherent risks there as well. Startups are unproven technology. Legacy programs have massive time horizons and carry big price tags. And so with commercial companies, along with us and our industry partners that are doing certain things, the technology and the pace of technology, countries are able to access things that they never otherwise would have at a price point that is much more affordable. And when you see that against the kind of backdrop of at the national level, the EU and EU countries raising their GDP targets for defense spending, both collectively and individually, I think that along with that watershed moment is really just kind of accelerating this conception of sovereignty and also kind of what that means either as a collective organization or kind of independently as a nation within Europe.
Yeah, and I think that this, push towards sovereignty, the people within my ecosystem, especially within the workforce development arena, we have to think about all of these opportunities that are becoming available and the fact that we don't have people to do the work. And we often forget about that. We often forget about it until it becomes something that's desperately needed. And we've seen several cases where people weren't prepared or aren't doing or are not prepared, and they're in situations that are in dire straits. So that's a lot of what I contribute to as far as the conversations are concerned. It's how do we prepare the workforce to be able to take care of the needs that we're going to have in space, and then understanding and making people knowledgeable to the fact that astronauts, engineers, scientists are not the only ones that find places in space. Every single thing that we need here, we need up there. And preparing that workforce, those space adjacents, is going to be a really important endeavor as we move towards this race.
Just pulling the string a little bit on the watershed event, which I fully agree with, and as well as all the other speakers' remarks. When that watershed event occurred, I think Europe and other governments and private industry executives took a look back and said, okay, here's the watershed event. Let's look at space. Today, And in that moment, somewhere between 83 and 87% of every kilo being put into space is being performed by a US launch services provider. The bulk of the megabits that are being used to communicate via broadband, via space, the large majority of that is through a US system. The Western world relies on two GPS systems, US GPS and Galileo. There's nothing else. There's Baidu, the Russians have something, the Chinese have something. So when we take a step back and look at sovereignty, where's the tech stack? Where are the capabilities? Access to space, use of space for commercial and for civil and for military applications. There remains today a very strong concentration from venture stage companies to growth stage companies to very mature companies. And the ones providing services today, building things, operating things, a very strong concentration in the US. So I think it comes back to sort of more holistically, this is a reaction to, if we believe that space is important, building things, operating things, managing things, and being in that ecosystem, we have to be interoperable, but we have got to build our own capabilities from the ground up.
Yeah, Dara, you were at, you moderated a panel at World Satellite Business Week, and one of the things I heard at your panel and several other places, made in Europe. Like that was the language that people were using. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about, where we're saying, well, you know, to Melissa's point, you know, we don't have the current capabilities in Europe to sustain industry independently. Is that part of this sovereignty conversation, or is that what you're hearing?
Yes, I mean, again, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not an analyst, I'm not a banker, I'm not a policy person, but in terms of what we're hearing, there's a few layers to this. Europe does not have the maturity of our innovation startup paradigm, right? This is something that's been quite unique to the US. It is evolving in Europe, it is evolving in Asia. But so much of the growth we've seen in the space industry the last 15, 20 years has been from early stage companies, from disruptors, from startups. So Europe, I think, realizes that they need to evolve that, they need to build that, they need to build their own tech stacks, their own sort of ecosystems of venture companies, growth stage companies, the entities that will build, design, operate things that go into space. There's very little of that in Europe. There is Arianespace, there is Eutelsat. We can talk about whether SES is US or whether it's Luxembourgish. There are companies, there is presence, there's Airbus, there's Thales. But if you do the math in terms of volume and things that are put into space and operated in space, the US still holds a significant advantage in all aspects of that ecosystem. So yes, it's hardware, it's software, it's know-how, it's manufacturing logic and scale.
You just said a whole thing that just made me just chuckle to an extent, because when I think about all the companies that you just named, those are big legacy companies, and we know those names. They're super important in our industry. But like you said, the startup thing, you know, a lot of that is happening out here in the United States. And so I guess over to you, Melissa. Here's a thought that I push at. When you guys are doing something like Spacecom or Spacecom Scotland, are you trying to create that ecosystem where Europe can succeed in, you know, incubating startups? Is that the goal?
No, I think it was pretty intentional to choose an American to be the head of US engagement, to definitely send, to be intentional with that process and to ensure that there was an overlap and interconnection with those in Europe. And the way that we're developing our shows, and we're not unique. I want to say we're the best, but we're not unique. We have competitors out there, but you're seeing shows now in Europe that are really bringing defense. They're bringing academia. They're bringing workforce development. They're bringing industry all under the same umbrella. This didn't happen 10, 15, 20 years ago. I know because I've lived in every single one of those arenas. We don't know how to talk to each other. We're not dealing with the same types of things. Leaders in those industries are not used to being in the same room and making decisions together. And now it is vital. It is vital for us to be in the same room, listening to each other and understanding. And our show does just that. We bring people together. We do matchmaker events. I personally connect all of my delegates to people that they can actually buy from. They can buy from them. I'm also scheduling them with appointments so that they're coming all the way across the pond and they're having a really good experience with the people that they're talking to. But we're doing those intentional things to ensure that we're massaging those relationships with those startups. We're encouraging it. And we actually have a startup event at both of our shows, which you're seeing a lot more here in the US and abroad. Opportunities for startups to pay a reduced rate, but also to have the opportunity to be seen, to be heard, and get access to information and opportunity. And I think that that is huge based upon what you said. It's great to think about the now, but in 15 years, we're gonna be wishing that we talked about the past.
Well, that lets me turn to BlackSky. Mikel, again, BlackSky is a US company. and you're doing really amazing and disruptive work, and yet you want to be having that conversation on the global field. How is that conversation going when you're having discussions with European countries, and how do you address this need that Europe is expressing, that we need to be able to be functional in our own right? How are you meeting that?
So, I mean, I think one really key thing to keep in mind is that this isn't day one for BlackSky in dealing with sovereignty. Actually, since kind of the early years, one of the things that we did is we kind of saw this trend line coming. Our leadership saw this. We have a long history of dealing with countries like Indonesia and India, where we've helped develop, field, and deploy sovereign capabilities. And so, one, we have that kind of lineage into this, but one of the other things that we see in this space is tremendous opportunity. This is a way to get at certain stated priorities of both helping capacity building, burden sharing, and at the same time, help allied and partnered information sharing and development. And if you kind of think about it in that sense of kind of a rising tide raises all ships. I mean, obviously, a business wants to make money. That's always a positive thing to funnel back into your development. But at the same time, there's a lot of inherent benefit we see with kind of this emergence of sovereignty within European nations. I think one really good example of this is the European Resiliency in Space initiative that's coming out of ESA. Now, there are some challenges there in the sense that US companies have to partner with European companies to compete. And I think that's where one of the things that we could see are some more kind of government to government or G2G conversations on. Europe has a very real security need right now. And if you want access and deployment of the best things on the market, kind of to the points that were made earlier, lowering some of those barriers would be massively beneficial to fielding capabilities right now. However, we still do see tremendous opportunity to help either with centers of excellence or helping with partnerships at the research and university and institutional level, as well as kind of commercial and B2B development to kind of feed into the European market. And the advantage that I think we bring along with some of our industry peers is our technology is proven. We have a long history with US government and the intelligence community that have kind of certified on some of the most stringent standards. And that's something I think that really can help support where ESA and where Europe and kind of that collective security need, we can help support that in a strong way as an industry.
I'm just going to stay with you for just a minute, because the work you do, Earth observation, obviously that has, a lot of very key, especially from the Center of Defense, a lot of key capabilities or abilities that governments have interest in. How does that conversation go? You mentioned that you've got a legacy of helping nations establish sovereignty. Is there a trust factor? I heard trust as one of the issues, right? Is there a trust factor that our data, when you're flying over and you're capturing images of our nation, that it's safe, that it's useful? How are you managing those conversations?
So I would say a lot of this is we provide or we kind of engage from a perspective of high touch. And so it's not just this kind of unidirectional approach of saying, here's what we think you need. What we try to do is we do the pre-work to understand what is the given, the customer that we're engaging at that point in time, where is their need, where are their gaps, where are solutions, and then we work with them through that process to iterate. And we say, hey, kind of go take things for a test drive, tell us what works for you, what doesn't, and then we help them. And I think one of the things that that really does is if you have a partner or a customer that has a lower level of awareness kind of what they need or what the security landscape is, this also helps them think about the things they don't know. It helps generate the questions that they could or should be asking. And it's this mutual discovery process. And I think baked into that is kind of this holistic or organic development of trust, because we see a lot of these as a long time horizon relationship. This isn't just a single, hey, we're just trying to fly in, fly out. And I think that that's one of the big things on top of the fact of technologically where we're at. I think we really provide certain things that we can get into more later, but we also have baked into our company's DNA a lot of AI stuff that helps augment and supplant countries or industries or agencies that may have sparse resources. And it's not to supplant, but rather augment capabilities.
Yeah, I think sovereignty kind of wears two faces. One is this positive face that says we want to have these programs that encourage workforce development, capacity building. We want to lift all boats up. We want everybody supported. And we also want to encourage, for example, transatlantic partnerships. There are a wealth of companies that have years of experience doing so many different services, many of which a lot of new space companies would need in order to succeed in Europe. The other face is a not so positive face, which is more restrictive, that thinks sovereignty is, European companies can't develop if they're being muscled out by competitors outside of Europe. And I think that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't leverage all of the space actors that have been doing things for a while, and doesn't ultimately get Europe where it wants to go. You see aspects of, I think, both faces in European legislation. The Space Act, for example, does include workforce development and capacity building programs. It also creates different licensing regimes for a European single market writ large and all other actors outside of Europe. And arguably, the one for the European single market is a lot easier to operate and get through than the one for non-European companies. And that doesn't help the European economy. It doesn't fulfill the goals of what that Space Act is. And it makes it more difficult for especially European small businesses to succeed in what can be a difficult space to be a SME.
I'm sorry, Michael. Yeah, I thought you were going to say something. Okay, I'm intrigued because we're having this conversation and I haven't yet heard anybody say Iris squared. So since somebody said, I'll say Iris squared. Right. So this is yet again, from what little bit I understand, it's a big initiative that's kind of, it's going to be a constellation. I don't quite know who all is building it, but how is Iris squared even going to play out with this European sovereignty thing? Who's built? Let me ask that question. Who's building it? Let's start there. And then is that getting us more on the path of actual expansion of Europe, or is it more Europe doing what Europe is used to doing, which is having kind of big, kind of top-down kind of things?
Yeah, so it's being built by SES, Eutelsat, and Hispasat, I think. And so technically, you have big and small European countries that are being represented in that. As you said, to the extent that SES is a Luxembourgish company, but I think one of the areas of concern that's been raised is, again, using the Space Act example, is that you'll have USPA kind of like organizing and like operating and supervising the Iris squared once it's deployed. And USPA is also going to be overseeing the licensing process and authorizations for what are essentially the competing constellations from non-European companies. And whether or not there's a conflict of interest there, I think raises a lot of worries for that proposed legislation. So I'll start with that.
Just to add some granularity here, what is Iris squared? Europe came to the view that just like with Galileo and its own European focused GPS system, they needed a LEO, low Earth orbit broadband system. And no single or two or three actors in Europe were able, or there was a view that would be able to do it by themselves. And so the idea was to essentially use, I wouldn't say rinse and repeat, but use the model for Galileo, which is to have a consortium put together, you heard the names, with a certain amount of European sovereign support, euros, 6 billion euros being committed by the European Commission, 4 billion to be put to sort of injected by the operating companies, and the additional gap, whatever that is, because nobody really knows today exactly how much it will cost, the additional layer to come in from the system offtake contracts, people paying for capacity in the system. Why? Because no single or two or three actors in Europe were going to or were doing this by themselves. The closest thing is OneWeb. OneWeb's really not fully European. It's owned mostly by Eutelsat, but there's a UK sovereign piece to it. And it was originally actually mostly an American system developed by Greg Weiler. And so that's what it is, because why? Broadband communications via low Earth orbit satellites have been viewed to be strategically critical and a gap filler where other types of communication systems won't work. And it is, again, a play to sovereignty, but I fully agree. You know, one of the downfalls or one of the risks of having these systems are that you're stovepiping the technology development, you're stovepiping the use cases, you're stovepiping the addressable market. And so it may fill the strategic goal of having a European broadband system to serve Europe, but is it the most efficient solution? Is it the strategically best solution? And, you know, there's some skepticism there.
Yeah, that was the, thank you. You used the language, because the thing that jumped out at me about it is that we're having this conversation, and in the course of this conversation, we're talking about the development of Europe. And what I hear is not that. I hear Iris saying, we're going to have a thing that we built in Europe, but that's not the same thing as developing Europe. Am I wrong? Yeah.
No, I'll just say something else, something that is more along the lines of building in Europe, developing Europe as part of the sovereign space phenomenon, or whatever we want to call it. The European Investment Bank has come together with something called the Security Action for Europe, SAFE. It's a $150 billion loan pool that's going to be made available essentially for space-related ancillaries and other technologies to help essentially industries form, develop, mature these industries. To me, that, at least, again, just being a lawyer, not an analyst or policy person, that seems to be a much sort of longer term feasible solution about raising independent sort of, call it continental abilities, longer term to be competitive in space and all of the ancillary tech that you need longer term to nurture these areas of technology, these areas of use. So it's sort of the old adage, you know, do you want to feed a person that's in financial distress, or do you want to teach them how to grow food so they can feed themselves?
Thank you for that. I see you nodding.
Yeah, I'm not STEMmy, as most of you can tell. I don't have one degree in science, technology, engineering, and math, but, you know, I just see the practicality from the perspective of, you know, from a European perspective, we need something that we can call ours, okay? We need something that's tangible. We need something that's physical. We need something that belongs to us so that we can protect ourselves. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And you're arguing that that's not going to get us there. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And I'm just breaking it down, because when you gave us the question, I was like, it's a both and.
Space is hard.
It's really hard.
Really, really hard.
There's so many, and it's the wild, wild west. You know, in the world that I live in, I'm intersecting between so many different parts of space. And the left very rarely knows what the right is doing, and it's usually the same thing. And they're just trying to beat each other to get there. But this really creates a pause for me, just from an applicational standpoint. We're putting effort into doing X, hoping that we get Y, but we really may not even be getting close. It's trial and error. Just think it's interesting how you poised it, painted that picture.
Okay, so we're going to build this big thing. It's going to be beautiful. We're going to throw some money at a development issue within Europe. Dara, something that you said that I want to pick up on, and I want the panel to react, is that we in the United States are kind of used to, good at, or it's just cultural, whatever it is, we do startups. This is a thing, right? We tend to have this kind of spirit. And again, what triggered my thought about this Iris thing is that it really does not sound like a startup initiative. It's a thing. There's these major companies that are legacy companies that are going to build this thing. Are there going to be plugins? Is there going to be some way where, you know, to the point you were just making before, there are ancillary aspects of the industry. There are other players that can make good use of a sovereign constellation. Where is the other play besides just the big thing that we're building?
I'll take a stab at it.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, this kind of goes back to a few different things that we've kind of discussed at this point. I mean, a few of us have referenced kind of the well-known phrase "space is hard," and one of the things that I think, going back to your point on the entrepreneurial component, is just culturally, because of that difficulty, that means that the likelihood and the frequency of failure tends to be high. And I think that there are certain aspects, for better or for worse, where like psychological and sociologically within our business environment in the United States, there's not necessarily a negative position of failure, because oftentimes through failure, you learn from your mistakes and then you grow to some point of realization. And I think typically, irrespective of which country you're talking about in Europe, that's just something that's not quite the same. It's, you know, might be similar in aspects. And one of the things, I think that's one of the things that you see a lot of European nations now trying to address, is how do they kind of break out of a lot of this fear of failure, and also to create the diversification within their industries, or create the diversification within their skill sets within their national bases. And I think, kind of getting back to that point, yes, these big, grand, exquisite, or, you know, enterprise or national systems are great, but I think also working on discrete opportunities to inject capability and find an opportunity to grow a specific skill set. So using Germany as one example, Germany is well known for its engineering, but its engineering tends to be more focused on kind of mechanical and traditional machine engineering. They have a massive dearth of AI and IT focused engineers, especially kind of within the software space, which, if you're not really initiated in that, it almost seems counterintuitive because of a lot of the assumptions we have of Germany, as far as how high tech their engineering is. I think one of the things that, if you look at, for us, you know, AI is a huge buzzword, but it's been baked into our DNA. It's something that we have continued to learn and iterate from. We focus not just on the AI that people see and that you kind of slap on, but also the AI that you expect, but you don't know is there. And so I think shaping these opportunities to grow this skill set and learn and develop those in that collaborative manner are where you have these discrete opportunities beyond just these kind of like large, massive kind of enterprise level initiatives.
I mean, 15, 20 years ago, we were reading books on the lean startup. At least entrepreneurs and innovators like me were. That's when I started my first company. And essentially a lean startup, spoiler alert, you throw something at the wall and you hope it sticks. If it doesn't, it's really easy for you to pick it back up and do something different. You're agile, you're lean, you don't put a lot of effort and energy into it. I'm not going to draw a correlation unless you've already done that to what's happening in space, but there are funding streams going to deep tech and other things where we don't actually know that we have products when these are done. I just went to a KPMG conference where we were talking about dump trucks in space and how people are getting multi-million dollars. They're not actually dump trucks, but you know what I mean. We're cleaning up debris in space. It sounds better if I say dump trucks, but we're cleaning up debris in space. And it's like, how do we do that? You know, so I text my colleague in Greece and I'm like, dude, we need to get on this. We're going to put dump trucks in space. But that was a whole methodology 20 years ago. Now you fast forward, and I love what you said about these hubs, the R&Ds. One of the closest ones to me in Central Florida is Tech Grove. If you don't know about it, you need to Google it now. It's incredible. And now we're developing other hub and innovation centers. There's ones in New Mexico, all the major space states, where nerdy space people like us can go there and can collaborate and bake ideas so that they're actually fluid, they can actually work. It's not just throwing things at the wall and hoping they stick, but it's connected to research and development. It's connected to processes and systems. And you come out of it with patents, hopefully, and opportunities to really grow the ecosystem. I love what you said about that. As technical as you are, the fact that you know about hubs and, and innovation centers, that's awesome.
I'm actually not technical.
You are
The
so
bio-
technical.
I came from a policy
Like
background.
if I had a tie on, I'd have to loosen up a little bit. You guys are technical. I'm like, I gotta bring my comic relief here.
No, I appreciate the thought of dump trucks did not lose me for the last few
Okay,
minutes, so-
okay, good. We'll talk about it later.
Jacob,
Yeah, I think also, space is hard. Perhaps navigating the European licensing bureaucracy might be the one thing that is harder. And when I first started at Access Partnership, I was really excited about space and satellite work. It was the one thing I wanted to work on more than anything else. And I got to help out on a project, got with our engineers, and was so scared immediately from trying to understand everything that was going on. But it also was illuminating about how difficult it is. If it was difficult for me, it's going to be difficult, I think, for a startup company that's trying to provide services in Europe. I think a big difference as well is that you have this fragmented regulatory landscape in Europe. If you're an American startup company, odds are you can provide services just to the US market. You should expand abroad, and it should be encouraged, and it should be made easier. But at least it provides a good starting point, and you can get a license in the US and operate. If you are a startup in Europe, your odds are, like, if you are from a smaller country, odds are you're not just providing services to that one European market. It wouldn't make sense. You're providing it to multiple of these. Again, to bring it back to the Space Act, it seeks to create a single space market for Europe, seeks to unify the licensing procedures so that these small companies can navigate it easier. I've never founded or worked at a startup myself. I can only imagine how difficult it is.
last
I'll
word.
just add that agree with everything being said, but let's not, I am a finance lawyer after all, let's come back to that stark reality that none of the innovation we've seen in the US, what we call new space, space 2.0, none of that would have happened if we didn't have this unique convergence of the ecosystem, whether you call it Silicon Valley or other places in the US and Florida, other spots where you have a combination of schools that are putting out bright young minds, government being present in the form of something like a JPL, a NASA Ames, or the ability to provide facilities, in-kind support, research grants, government dollars going into the same ecosystem, and then a very risk-tolerant, in fact, risk-seeking set of venture investors that are happy to throw money at things, hoping 1 out of 10, 1 out of 12, 1 out of 15 hit the jackpot. That ecosystem, as it grew in the US the past 20, 30 years, whatever you want to call it, didn't really exist anywhere else. Now it is evolving now in the UK, in Europe, parts of the continent, parts of Asia, other parts of the world. It is, but it is behind. And so it's complicated, it's layered, but without that kind of an ecosystem where there's risk appetite to try new things, to go fast, to break things, to change paradigms, have the regulatory structure that will allow it, have the scale of the market where if you hit the jackpot, you can test it in a market before you take it cross-border. That's something that's been a very key ingredient to innovation in the US. That's why the US is where it is when it comes to space technology. The world eventually will catch up. That's a matter of time. But to replicate that ingredient in this paradigm is not that easy, and it will take time.
Wow, I love ending on that point. I'm going to ask a question. We're not going to have time to answer it, but I'm just going to put it out there, and we'll pick up from that point in the second half. So I'm sorry to our guests on Zoom who will not be able to be a part of that conversation, but please give some thought to this. What I'm hearing from everyone is exactly why the EU was formed in the first place, right? Europe is made up of lots and lots and lots and lots of countries, some of which are really tiny. And so in order to have a viable, competitive commercial environment, they needed to conglomerate. So they created the EU. And so therefore there is a space market that's addressable because the EU is a big thing as opposed to a tiny nation over here and a tiny nation over there. And so there's a lot of opportunity. The question is how does Europe engage it? And then my other question is, and so then, right? Is the UK even part of that anymore? Like that's another question because they left that. So anyway, we'll get back to that in part 2, but I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping right now. And I want to thank, first of all, for those who are leaving this session right now, I want to thank our panelists once again, Dara Panahy, Patton, Mikel Savides, and Jacob Hafey. Okay, just some housekeeping notes. Hey, SSPI WISE is going to be at Silicon Valley Space Week on the 27th of October. We are having a structured networking event for the women in the industry. Listen, women, we are a tiny minority of this industry still. And the practice of networking, of getting ourselves out and about and learning how to talk to people. I can tell you I'm in the industry 24 going on 25 years, and that this is still one of the harder things for me. So we're going to have a structured networking reception at Silicon Valley. That is the Monday before Satellite Innovation. And speaking of Europe and the UK, we will be having the Better Satellite World Awards dinner. Tickets are currently on sale. It is on the first Monday of December every year. This year, that's literally December 1st. www.bswdinner.com. It is an awesome event. If anybody has been to London anytime in the entire month of December, you know that it is Christmas in the entire month of December in London. So do come. Okay, and we will be back at 5:30. We're going to take a quick break right now and have some nibbles and coffee and stuff, and we'll be back for no holds barred conversation. Thank you all.